Hello and welcome to this week's Productivity Enhancer. Today and next week we're going to be taking a look at the blur tools in Photoshop in this two-part weekly Productivity Enhancer. If you're just now making the switch to CS6, you'll notice that the blur, sharpen, and smudge tools work just the same as before, and we'll cover those tools too, but we're also going to check out the new blur gallery, which is new to CS6. The blur gallery gives you quick and easy ways to draw focus in your photo by blurring out very specific parts of that photo, but we'll get to that in a second. First, let's run through the standard blur tools in Photoshop. So if we go over here to our tool palette, you can see right now it's set to the Sharpen tool, but if we just right click and then we can see we have the blur tool. Let's select the blur tool. Before we actually do anything with this tool, it's very important to point out the blur tool, Sharpen tool, and smudge tool, if used on our just regular photograph, they are destructive editing. So any changes you make to your photograph with either of these tools is going to result in destructive editing that if you save it, you're not going to be able to undo it. So I can't emphasize enough that I do not recommend this technique of using the blur tool. Destructive editing is always dangerous, and you always want to make sure that you have an option to undo. Even after you save a photograph, you want to be able to undo an edit that is potentially destructive. So having said that, once we choose the blur tool, we can change the size of the brush head, and we can either use the slider or we can select from one of the pre-sized brush heads here. You can see we have a 24 pixel brush head, and we can even change that from there. Drop it down, you can see we have all kinds of presets. In fact, instead of these square brushes, I think we're going to use these round brushes. So we'll click OK for replace current brushes, and then I'll just select one of these round ones here. And then I'll just drag this slider up to make it a pretty big round blur. That looks good there. And when I go to try and use this blur tool, you can see this message comes up. The smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Edit contents will no longer be available. Rasterize the smart object? So, in order to use the blur tool, we do need to rasterize this photograph, and that way we will have destructive editing. So, just for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to click OK and rasterize this photograph, and now we can use this blur tool. So let's just go ahead and blur out some of these areas here. It looks like my round brush didn't take, but that's okay. We'll use this square brush. And we'll just go ahead and blur out specific parts here. And this should allow our eye to be drawn directly to the center of the photograph. Just take some of the sharpness out of it. It's a very light blur. You won't be able to notice the difference until we toggle it off. So Control Z, undo, and you can see that we do have quite the difference. So we'll just continue to blur. Just make some of this background a little less focused. So that's how we use the blur tool. Let's go ahead and delete all of this action though, because we do not want destructive editing on our photograph. So now that we've unrasterized this photo, you can see that the blur tool is not working. So that's good. That's exactly what we want. So how do we make use of the blur tools without destroying our photograph? Well, we can always add a blank layer and perform all of our blur edits in that blank layer. But there is one thing that you need to be aware of for that to happen. So let's go ahead and add that layer. So now layer 1 is a blank layer. Now we need to go up and click Sample All Layers. That way those blur tools will still have access to the information underneath that layer, but it won't actually do any destructive editing to the actual photograph. So now that Sample All Layers is selected, we can go ahead and blur on top of this blank layer. And you can see it's applying the blur just like it was before, only we're in the blank layer. So here we go. We'll just blur out some of this area here, some of the background. Just blur it down a little bit. And now if we toggle that layer off, you can see a difference. Here it is with it on. And you can see, let's add a little more blur here just to make it a little more apparent. There, that looks good there. We'll keep it. So let's toggle this layer off again so you can see the difference. Here it is without the blur, and here it is with the blur. So let's right click on this blur tool and take a look at what else we have. Here you see we have Sharpen, and the Sharpen tool works just the same. If we take advantage of it on the regular photograph, it will be destructive editing. However, on this empty layer here, we can utilize it without touching a single pixel in our photograph. And we also have the smudge tool down here, which we'll get to in a second. However, let's just go ahead and choose the Sharpen tool. I'm going to zoom in here so we can get a good look at our subject. So what we want to do is sharpen up this eye and the snout of the lizard, and maybe down the arm and down the back of it. We just want our subject to be as sharp as possible. So we just sharpen here, and you can see the eyes getting a little darker, maybe a little clearer. And let's just go down the back of this lizard here, get all of these scales nice and clear, and his leg. And let's check out the rest of his. Here we got some fingers here that need to be cleared up. And we can even do the back legs and toes and its tail. Just sharpen all of this area up just a little bit. So let's zoom out and take a look here. Actually, let's zoom all the way out. And when we toggle off that layer, you can see the eye is just really popping. The scales and some of the detail in the lizard has just been enhanced just a little bit. And now let's take a look at the smudge tool. The smudge tool does just what it sounds. Here, let's make this a little bigger, and you can see that it just drags pixels in the direction of your cursor drag. There, it gets smudged. And there you go. We have 3 smudges on our photograph. And this is a pretty heavy-handed editing technique. So if you're going to use the smudge tool, you're going to need to be absolutely positive that it's the effect you're looking for. So let's just go ahead and delete these smudges here, because I know for a fact that I do not want them on this photograph. And that's a quick review of the blur tools on the regular tool palette in Photoshop. So although that's only half of the blur tools that I wanted to cover, that's it for this week. We're going to pick up next week with the blur gallery tools that are new to CS6. So thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Until next time.